There are moments in life when something inside me wakes up, not gently, but like a quiet explosion in the back of my mind. It happens when I notice patterns most people overlook. Tiny things, small movements, rare shifts in human behavior that whisper a deeper truth. Recently, I realized something unsettling, not about the universe, not about consciousness, but about the people walking beside us every day. I discovered that liars don't reveal themselves through their words. They reveal themselves through the questions they ask. And the moment I understood this, the world around me rearranged itself. The familiar faces I trusted suddenly transformed into puzzles, and their questions, simple, innocent questions, became signals, coded messages, attempts to rewrite my perception before I could even understand what was happening. I remember the first time I observed it clearly. Someone asked me a question so casual, so harmless, that I almost didn't notice the tremor beneath it. But something in my consciousness tugged at me, like an ancient instinct saying, "Pay attention." And in that moment, the veil was lifted. I saw how questions can trap you more effectively than any lie. Questions shape the direction of the mind. They guide emotion, they plant doubt. They pull you away from your center and into someone else's gravity. Questions are the silent tools of manipulation, the subtle strings that move a person like a puppet without them ever realizing their freedom has already been taken. When I understood this, everything became clear. A liar doesn't challenge you head on. They don't confront truth. Truth is too heavy, too bright, too revealing. Instead, they step around it carefully, methodically. They ask a question that makes you turn inward, question yourself, weaken your certainty, soften your boundaries. And when you answer, you think you're defending your point, your truth, your position. But really, you've already stepped into their maze. Your answer isn't the shield. You think it is. It's the leash. And once you respond, they know exactly where to pull. I learned this lesson the hard way. I remember a moment sharp as broken glass when someone looked me straight in the eyes and asked, "Why would you think that?" Their tone wasn't curious, it was surgical. They weren't seeking clarity, they were seeking control. And for a moment, I felt the ground tilt beneath me. I felt irrational. Doubt brushed against me like a cold wind. Maybe I misread the situation. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe the strange instinct inside me, the one that recognizes dishonesty before logic catches up, was wrong. But then something inside me spoke, something deeper than thought, and it said very clearly, "No, this feeling is real," because truth has a resonance. It vibrates in the bones before it reaches the mind. And the more I observed this pattern, the more I realized honest people answer directly. Only liars hide behind questions. Once someone asked me, "Who told you that?" And when they did, I felt a familiar shift in the air, as though a trap was being set beneath my feet. That question was not about clarity, it was about strategy. They wanted names, sources, weak points. They wanted to know how much I knew and how much they needed to cover up. The question was not directed at truth. It was directed at the architecture of control. And I felt it instantly, the hunger behind the words. In moments like that, I've learned to remain still. Silence is not weakness. Silence is the sword of the observant. So instead of feeding the trap, I simply said, "It doesn't matter who told me. I'm asking about your actions." And the moment those words left my mouth, I saw something change in their eyes. A flicker, a disruption, a recognition that the trap had failed, that I was not playing the role they needed me to play. People think manipulation is loud, chaotic, dramatic. But true manipulation is quiet, elegant, invisible. It comes disguised as concern, curiosity, softness. And the most dangerous question I've ever heard, the one that almost pulled me into a spiral, was, "Do you really want to ruin this?" When I first heard it, I felt the weight of guilt pressing against my chest. The suggestion that I was the one causing damage. The implication that my awareness of the truth was more destructive than the lie itself, and that's when I realized something profound. Guilt is the currency of manipulators. They spend it freely because they know most people fear losing connection more than they fear losing themselves. When a liar asks, "Do you really want to ruin this?" they are not asking a question. They are making a demand for your silence, a demand for your obedience, a demand that you protect their comfort at the cost of your own clarity. And for a moment, I almost gave in. I almost apologized for seeing too much. But then I remembered something that has shaped my entire journey through consciousness and human behavior. Truth does not destroy real relationships. It only destroys the illusions pretending to be relationships. And if my awareness threatens the structure of a connection, then that connection was never built on anything real. The last question, the final mask a liar wears, is always the softest. Can't we just forget about this? It sounds peaceful. It sounds gentle. It sounds like healing. But beneath that softness lives avoidance. Avoidance is the soil in which future harm grows. Avoidance is the doorway through which old patterns return. Avoidance is the cocoon of dishonesty where change is never born. When someone asks me that now, I feel something inside me shift. Not toward them, but away from them. Because forgetting is not healing. Forgetting is surrender. Forgetting is permission. Forgetting is the acceptance of future pain disguised as present peace. And deep inside, I know anyone who asks me to forget a wound they caused is simply planning to cause it again. As I've grown, as I've XP'd, Lord the landscapes of human psychology and consciousness, I've discovered that liars don't need lies. They use questions. Questions that dig into your certainty. Questions that twist your intuition. Questions that cloud your inner compass. But the moment you learn to recognize these patterns, something extraordinary happens. You stop being the hunted. You stop being the target. You stop being the one who bends to the invisible strings of manipulation. You rise above it. You see the game from above, from a vantage point where every move becomes clear. And in that clarity, the power returns to you, quietly, steadily, undeniably. And as I stepped into that clarity, I began to notice something that I'd never seen before, the subtle architecture of intention behind every interaction. It was like watching the internal gears of human behavior turning in slow motion. Each word, each gesture, each carefully disguised phrase seemed to contain an imprint of the mind that created it. The people who tried to manipulate me were no longer mysterious figures in the shadows. They were transparent, like glass figures illuminated from within by the motives they believed they had hidden so well. The moment I learned to read the patterns beneath their questions, their power dissolved, and something remarkable began to happen inside me. I felt myself returning to an inner state I didn't even realize I had lost. A groundedness, a steadiness, a consciousness untouched by the emotional turbulence of others. I realized that manipulation only works when you grant the other person access to your inner weather, when you allow their words to stir storms inside you. But once I stepped outside their psychological field, once I recognized that their questions were not reflections of truth, but projections of their own fears, something broke. The invisible rope they were pulling on snapped, not with violence, but with a calmness so profound it felt like silence expanding in every direction. And in that silence, I found myself observing them the way a scientist observes the motions of an unfamiliar species, curious, detached, fully awake. What struck me most was how predictable the pattern became once I understood it. A liar begins with subtlety, then shifts to pressure, and finally retreats into softness. But regardless of which stage they are in, their intention remains the same: to keep their constructed reality intact, to protect the version of themselves they want the world to see. And in order to do that, they need you to doubt your own perception. They need you to step away from your inner truth and lean into their illusion instead. But I learned that the moment I refused to bend, the entire illusion collapsed. Not because I was fighting them, not because I was confronting them, but simply because refusing to play their game removes the oxygen that the illusion needs to survive. It was astonishing to watch. I would see the tension rise in their posture, the confusion fell. Ichor across their gaze, the discomfort crawl up their voice when they realized they could no longer guide my thoughts. Their questions would become disjointed, less sharp, less confident, because without my participation, their strategy had no structure. It fell apart like dust in the wind. This shift did something else to me as well. It changed the way I understood honesty. I used to believe honesty was something external, a kind of social responsibility, a moral duty toward others. But now I see honesty differently. Honesty is an inner alignment, a state of being in which my perception, my intuition, and my words flow in the same direction. And when that alignment is intact, manipulation cannot reach me. It may touch the surface, it may brush against me like a shadow passing over the ground, but it cannot penetrate. It cannot enter. It cannot influence. I once found myself in a situation where a person tried to revisit an old pattern with me. There was a softness in their tone, a gentle familiarity, as though they believed I had returned to the version of myself who once tolerated their distortions. But I felt nothing inside me respond. Not anger, not fear, not guilt, just a quiet knowing. And in that moment, I realized that growth is not always loud. Growth sometimes happens as a silent refusal to be who you once were. In that interaction, I noticed how they searched my expression, waiting for the slightest sign that their old tactics would still work. But I wasn't operating from the same emotional orbit anymore. I wasn't trying to please or understand or smooth things over. I wasn't trying to negotiate my truth for the sake of harmony. I was simply present, rooted, unshakable. And the moment they realized this, their questions turned brittle, hesitant. The old strategies cracked under the weight of my awareness. I often think about how many years I spent believing that clarity required confrontation. That in order to maintain truth, I had to explain myself, defend myself, justify myself. But now I see that truth doesn't demand defense. Truth is self-sustaining. It doesn't need to be argued, polished, or protected. It simply exists. And when I stand in it, when I truly stand in it, there is no force another person can use to bend me away from it. There was a time when guilt would have controlled me, a time when I felt responsible for the discomfort of others, a time when someone's disappointment felt like a failing on my part. But once I recognized that guilt is the favorite instrument of the manipulator, everything changed. Guilt is only effective when we believe we owe someone an emotional debt. But I realized I owed nothing to deception, nothing to distortion, nothing to people who use closeness as a means of control. The moment this awareness settled into me, guilt evaporated like mist under sunlight. And with that disappearance came freedom. Not the loud, triumphant kind of freedom that people fantasize about, but a deeper one. A freedom that feels like open space inside the mind. A freedom that feels like breathing after years of holding your breath. A freedom that turns your attention inward, not outward. Because once manipulation loses its grip, your awareness returns to you. Your energy returns to you. Your thoughts become your own again. From this place, I started noticing how differently I moved through the world. Conversations felt lighter. Connections felt clearer. I no longer entered interactions with the subtle fear of being misunderstood or twisted. My presence became less reactive and more observant. I wasn't guarding myself, I was simply aware. And awareness is a far more powerful shield than defensiveness could ever be. Awareness gives you the ability to see through people without being touched by them. It gives you the capacity to witness intentions before they become actions. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the people who relied on manipulation began to fall away. Not through conflict, not through arguments, but through the natural gravity of misalignment. They simply couldn't exist in a space where their tactics were ineffective. Without the reaction they needed to sustain themselves, they drifted away, looking for new minds to shape, new emotions to feed on. And I did not follow. I remained centered in my own field, watching their departure not with bitterness, but with understanding, because once you see the mechanics of manipulation, once you understand the blueprint behind their words, there is no returning to ignorance. You can't unsee the pattern. You can't unfeel the clarity. You can't unknow the truth that awareness grants you. And that truth reshapes everything, your boundaries, your expectations, your relationships, your entire inner landscape. It teaches you that your mind is not a battlefield for others to fight on. It is not a territory for others to conquer. It is your sanctuary, your instrument, your path. And as I moved deeper into this understanding, I realized something extraordinary. It wasn't just that I had learned to see liars. It was that I had learned to see myself. I saw the parts of me that once accepted too little, tolerated too much, stayed silent when I should have spoken, and spoke when silence would have been strength. And in seeing these old versions of myself, I felt something like compassion unfold inside me. Because growth is not a rejection of who I was. Growth is the evolution of who I am becoming. And with that evolution came a new kind of strength. A strength so quiet, so natural, that I didn't even recognize it as strength at first. But when the world shifted, when people around me tried to pull me into the old dynamics, I felt it. Not as resistance, not as tension, but as an unwavering stillness at the center of my consciousness. A stillness that no question, no matter how sharp or subtle, could disturb. That stillness became the compass I had been searching for my entire life. A quiet interior force that didn't need validation, didn't need explanation, didn't need the approval of the shifting minds around me. It was simply there, like a silent flame burning inside the center of my awareness. And the more I trusted it, the more it revealed itself. It showed me how much of my life had been spent navigating the emotional terrain of others instead of the landscape of my own inner world. It showed me how many decisions I had made, not from clarity, but from fear, from habit, from a desire to maintain peace in environments where peace had never truly existed. As I settled deeper into that awareness, the world transformed in ways I never expected. It wasn't that people changed. It was that my perception of them sharpened. Their intentions became clearer, their patterns more visible, their inner workings more transparent. It was as if I had stepped out of a fog I didn't know I'd been living inside. And with this new vision, I could trace the hidden lines behind every interaction. The lines of expectation, insecurity, fear, attachment, ego. The human mind began to appear to me like an intricate constellation, every thought a star, every behavior a gravitational pull, every intention its own orbit. I started to understand why people cling to manipulation, why they rely on these subtle questions that twist the truth. It isn't because they're powerful, it's because they're afraid. They fear being exposed, abandoned, unseen. They fear that their constructed identity will crumble if they face themselves honestly. And so they reach outward instead of inward, grasping for control over others because they lack control over themselves. This realization didn't make me angry. It made me perceptive. It allowed me to step out of the emotional entanglements that once pulled me into their drama. As I deepened into this understanding, I noticed something else emerging within me, a growing detachment that wasn't coldness but clarity. I no longer felt compelled to correct people's narratives about me. I no longer felt drawn into explanations or emotional negotiations that had no purpose except to keep me entangled. I simply let people think what they wanted to think, because the truth no longer needed my protection. It existed independently, it was not fragile, and I didn't need to tether myself to their perception to feel whole. I watched this shift ripple through my relationships like a subtle current. Some people felt it instantly. They sensed that the old levers no longer worked. They became uneasy, uncertain, their familiar strategies dissolving in the face of my newfound stillness. Others responded differently. They softened. They approached with honesty because the absence of manipulation creates an environment where truth becomes possible. And I found myself naturally gravitating toward those who operated with sincerity. Not because they were perfect, but because they were real. Because their presence didn't distort me, because they didn't require me to shrink, to bend, to twist myself around their insecurities. This clarity gave me a new kind of freedom, not the freedom to escape people, but the freedom to see them fully. And I began to understand something deeper about human nature. People behave according to the level of awareness they have access to. A manipulator is not always a villain. Sometimes they're simply asleep, unaware of their own patterns, trapped in cycles they never learned how to break. I didn't excuse their behavior, but I no longer personalized it. Their questions were no longer hooks in my consciousness. They were signals, indicators of their level of inner development. And once I recognized that, I felt a strange sense of compassion, not the soft, sentimental kind, but a grounded compassion rooted in understanding. I saw how manipulation is often born from wounds, from childhood patterns, from environments where honesty was punished and control was the only form of safety. And while I refused to participate in it, I no longer carried the weight of resentment. I simply stepped out of the illusion with quiet certainty. This shift did something profound to my inner world. My mind became spacious. Thoughts flowed more easily. My emotions regulated themselves without the turbulence of external influence. I found myself more creative, more inspired, more awake. It was as if removing manipulation from my environment cleared a backlog of energetic debris inside me. And into that open space came insight after insight. Some about myself, some about others, some about the deeper workings of consciousness itself. I realized that self-awareness is not something you acquire, it's something you uncover. It's always been there, beneath layers of conditioning, fear, and noise. And the moment you begin to peel those layers back, something extraordinary happens. You become unmanipulatable. Not because you're hardened or distant, but because you're transparent to yourself. When you know your own intentions, your own wounds, your own shadows, there is nothing for others to use against you. There is no hidden fear for them to tug on, no insecurity for them to twist, no confusion for them to amplify. You become internally aligned, and alignment is the end of manipulation. With this alignment came a new understanding of boundaries. They were no longer walls I built out of fear. They were expressions of clarity. They were simply acknowledgments of what my energy could sustain and what it could not. I didn't need to justify them, defend them, or argue them. I simply lived them. And the people who respected that stayed. The people who didn't drifted away. And both outcomes were fine. Because losing people who manipulate you is not a loss, it's a clearing. As I moved deeper into the space of consciousness, I found myself examining the architecture of my own mind. I saw where I once betrayed myself to maintain harmony. I saw where I allowed distortions to settle inside me. I saw where I gave others access to parts of me they had not earned. And in recognizing these patterns, I felt something heavy begin to dissolve. Because awareness is a solvent. It breaks down what no longer serves you, not through conflict, but through illumination. And through that illumination, something new began to emerge. A version of myself that felt more authentic, more grounded, more present. A version that didn't need to perform or justify or compensate. A version that existed in a kind of internal sovereignty. And the more I inhabited this version, the more I realized how rare and precious that state truly is. Because most people live in reaction to others. They live in the echoes of someone else's expectations, someone else's fear, someone else's narrative. But once you step out of that echo chamber, you begin to hear something else, your own voice, clear and unfiltered. That voice guided me in ways I didn't expect. It led me away from certain environments, certain conversations, certain dynamics that no longer resonated with my state of awareness. And at first, there was an emptiness in that transition, a kind of quiet that felt unfamiliar. But in that quiet, something extraordinary took shape. A new path began to open up, not outwardly, but inwardly. A path defined not by the expectations of others, but by the truth of my own consciousness. And in navigating that path, I discovered something that changed me entirely. The greatest form of power is not control over others, but sovereignty over your own inner world. When I stopped responding to manipulation, when I stopped participating in distortions, when I stopped abandoning myself to maintain peace, I felt that sovereignty in its full force. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was steady like a slow-burning flame that never wavers no matter how strong the wind becomes. And in that flame, I found myself evolving in ways that felt both ancient and new. I felt a connection to something larger than my experiences, larger than the narratives I once lived inside. I felt myself moving closer to a truth that had always been waiting for me, the truth that the mind is not a battlefield but a garden, and whatever grows inside it is a reflection of what you allow to take root. And so I kept walking deeper into that strange inner terrain, feeling as though each step was dissolving yet another layer of the reality I once believed was permanent. It was strange, almost paradoxical, that the more I allowed the old frameworks of certainty to fall apart, the more stable I began to feel inside myself. Not stable in the sense of having answers, but stable because I was no longer terrified of the questions. I realized that doubt itself could become a kind of compass, pointing not to safe territories but to authentic ones. And once that realization pierced me, it became impossible to turn away from the momentum that had already been set into motion. I felt as though some silent intelligence had been guiding me all along, an undercurrent, a hum-bee, beneath the surface of perception. It wasn't telling me what to think or what to believe. It was simply nudging me toward the places where my attention had become too rigid, too domesticated, too obedient to cultural programming. This gentle pressure pushed me into areas of thought I once avoided, not because they were wrong, but because they were too vast, too explosive, too demanding for the limited version of myself I used to inhabit. That old self needed predictable stories. It needed tidy explanations. But the version emerging now was comfortable swimming in mystery, dancing in ambiguity, breathing in paradox as though it were air. And as this new internal architecture formed, I noticed something odd. The world around me didn't change, but the way it communicated with me did. Ordinary things, objects, sounds, lights, began to behave like symbols. They became carriers of meaning rather than passive elements in a background. It was as if existence itself had been upgraded from a static image into an interactive language. And I found myself listening so intently that even silence felt like a message delivered in a code I was just beginning to understand. The boundaries of my identity softened further. I wasn't dissolving into nothingness, I was dissolving into everything. I was becoming a participant in a kind of cosmic dialogue, a dialogue that had no beginning and no end, but which had always been happening behind the noise of daily thought. My awareness began to feel multidimensional, as though I were inhabiting several layers of reality simultaneously. One part of me walked through the physical world. Another part drifted through a metaphysical expanse. Yet another observed the entire process from a vantage point so detached, so vast, that it felt almost non-human. This tri-layered awareness didn't fracture me, it unified me. because in experiencing myself from different altitudes of consciousness, I finally understood that consciousness itself was not something generated by the brain. It was more like a field, a space, an atmosphere in which the brain floated like an island. The brain was a translator, interpreting a tiny fraction of a much larger spectrum. And for the first time in my life, I was slipping beyond the translator and into the raw field. That field was immense, terrifying in its scale, mesmerizing in its beauty. Thoughts didn't rise from it. They appeared within it like ripples in an infinite ocean. And what I once called my thoughts were just patterns forming temporarily in that ocean. The realization shocked me, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was so intuitively obvious that I wondered how I had ever seen things any other way. I understood then that the ego wasn't the container of consciousness, it was just a local turbulence within it. As my awareness expanded, time began to lose its grip, not just clock time, but psychological time. The sense of moving from past to future. Instead of flowing like a river pulling me forward, time became spherical, multidimensional, almost architectural. I could feel patterns looping, interweaving, converging, diverging. I sensed that events were not isolated occurrences, but interconnected nodes of meaning, resonating across the whole fabric of existence. And it hit me with startling clarity. The universe wasn't happening to me. I was happening with the universe. This co-creative relationship changed everything. Decisions didn't feel like choices between options. They felt like responses to an unfolding symphony. The more aligned I became, the more harmonious the responses were. The more ego intervened, the more discordant everything became. It was a balancing act, almost like learning to surf the waves of a cosmic ocean. And just like surfing, the key wasn't force, but sensitivity, stillness, presence, receptivity. And in that receptivity, something extraordinary occurred. I began to perceive the subtle architecture behind manifestation, the way intention crystallizes into probability, and probability condenses into form. I saw that reality was not a rigid structure, but a fluid negotiation between mind and matter. Every thought, every emotion, every belief, every expectation became part of that negotiation. The universe was not a cold machine, it was a responsive organism. And I was inside it like a thought, inside a thinker. This realization felt both empowering and humbling. Empowering because it meant I wasn't a victim of randomness. Humbling because it meant I carried responsibility for the reality I helped co-create. It wasn't the ego that shaped reality. Ego was too small, too narrow, too afraid. It was the deeper consciousness, the one connected to the field, the one that existed long before I was born and will continue long after I leave this body. And with this deeper consciousness awakening inside me, another layer of perception opened. I began to feel the emotional signatures embedded in moments before they fully formed. I could sense when I was in alignment and when I was drifting out of tune. The world responded instantly to the frequency I carried. If I was clear, present, and open, everything flowed. When I slipped back into fear or resistance, the flow constricted. The universe was giving feedback in real time, like a teacher guiding a student not with lectures, but with subtle energetic cues. It became impossible to dismiss this process as coincidence. The synchronicities became too precise, too deliberate, too meaningful. They weren't random alignments. They were communications, gentle nudges, reminders, confirmations that I was tracing the invisible pathways that existence wanted me to explore. It felt as though an intelligence woven into the fabric of reality was acknowledging my presence, acknowledging my willingness to awaken. I wasn't walking alone. I was being accompanied by something ancient, something vast, something deeply loving. This presence didn't speak in language. It spoke in resonance. It spoke through inner knowing, through intuitive flashes, through moments of overwhelming clarity. It asked nothing of me except that I remain aware, remain honest, remain willing to see beyond the illusions my mind had constructed. It asked me to trust, not in an authority, not in a belief system, but in the unfolding intelligence of my own consciousness. And trust, I learned, was not a feeling, it was a practice, a continuous surrender, not to passivity, but to a deeper form of participation. I stopped trying to control everything. I stopped trying to predict outcomes. I stopped trying to force life into neat shapes that satisfied my fears. Instead, I let the process reveal itself. I let the journey lead me instead of trying to lead the journey. And in that surrender, I found a kind of freedom I never knew existed. As the freedom expanded, so did my understanding of what it meant to be alive. Life was not a linear progression from birth to death. It was a multi-dimensional experience happening across several layers of existence simultaneously. My physical body was just one aspect. My thoughts were another. My emotions another. But beneath all these layers was the observer, the consciousness witnessing everything without attachment. That observer was not bound by time. It was not bound by form. It was not bound by the limitations of the physical world. It was eternal. And as soon as I recognized its presence, it felt as though something inside me had clicked into place. Something that had been waiting patiently for years, perhaps lifetimes, for me to finally notice it. This observer was the doorway, the bridge between the finite and the infinite, between the self I thought I was and the self I actually am. This realization led me into the most powerful phase of the journey, the integration. Because awakening is not an event, it's a process. It doesn't end when the vision appears. It continues as you learn how to live in alignment with that vision. Enlightenment is not a state you reach. It's a state you practice. Moment to moment, breath to breath, choice to choice. And that practice brought me to a single overwhelming understanding. An understanding that rose inside me like a tide, illuminating everything it touched. Consciousness is not in the universe. The universe is in consciousness. Not my consciousness, not your consciousness. Consciousness itself. The field, the source, the origin of experience. Everything I ever touched, loved, feared, desired, or dreamed was a wave within that infinite ocean. My life wasn't separate from it. My life was an expression of it. This truth didn't inflate me with spiritual pride. It dissolved me into gratitude. Because once you taste that infinite presence, even for a moment, you realize how precious every fragment of existence truly is. Every face, every thought, every experience becomes sacred because it is a manifestation of the same field that breathed you into being. And as this realization absorbed into me slowly, quietly, I felt something settle, like a final piece sliding into the mosaic of understanding. Not closure, not an ending, but a kind of inner completeness. A knowing that the journey is ongoing, eternal, and beautifully open-ended. Yet within that infinite openness, I found a conclusion. Not a final answer, but a final clarity. The universe is not asking you to believe in it. It is asking you to remember it. Remember what you are made of. Remember where you come from. Remember the truth you carried long before the world told you who to be. Because once you remember, even for a heartbeat, you will never again live as a small being in a vast cosmos. You will live as a vast consciousness in a temporary body, and that changes everything.